Hi everyone, welcome back to this channel. Thank you so much for joining me here today. My name is Lindsay Birch, for those who don't know, and I'm here to disciple you, the kingdom leaders. Okay, so let's just jump into our story for today. Now, where we're reading from in the Bible today, we're reading from a few different places, and let's just start from the beginning of how we got to this story today. So I've been reading quite slowly through Exodus, starting with Genesis like 6 months ago, probably even longer than that, and very slowly going from Genesis through to Exodus now, and I'm up to Exodus chapter 30, and I've been here for like the past week because, you know, some days I read this and some days I'm like, oh, I'll just read a proverb or something instead like late at night or whatever. I don't feel like thinking so hard, so that's why I'm going a bit more slowly. But let me just share with you where I'm up to in Exodus chapter 30. We're starting in verse 11, and this is going to sound super random, so just bear with me. It's the subheading for this in my Bible, at least, is called the ransom money. So it says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses saying," and for context, once again, I love giving you context. It's really important for us to understand the context around any and every passage that we read. So the context around this one is that God has just been teaching Moses about how the tabernacle in the wilderness needs to be built, the portable tent temple essentially, and all the different pieces of furniture and all these different things that go inside of it. So that's the context of all this, how to have the holy worship service essentially going forward. So this is the background, and now God is saying, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, when you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, then every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there may be no plague among them when you number them. This is what everyone among those who are numbered shall give: half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. A shekel is 20 gerahs. The half shekel shall be an offering to the Lord. Everyone included among those who are numbered from 20 years old and above shall give an offering to the Lord. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less than half a shekel when you give an offering to the Lord to make atonement for yourselves. And you shall make the atonement money and you shall take the atonement money of the children of Israel, and shall appoint it for the service of the tabernacle of meeting, that it may be a memorial for the children of Israel before the Lord to make atonement for yourselves." Okay, now this probably sounds super random, and a lot of the Old Testament can sound super random without extra context, but as I was reading this story, it reminded me, those first couple of verses reminded me of another story that takes place a little bit later in the Old Testament, and it reminded me of that time where very late in King David's reign, when he's getting to be a pretty old guy, he's probably in his 70s at this point, he decides to take a census of the Israelites. And let's just turn to that. But very quickly prefacing it, we see that it's not done in a way that God appreciates or approves of, and God gets pretty upset about the whole situation, and there's some things that need to happen. So there are actually two places that we can find this story in the Bible, and that is 2 Samuel chapter 24 and 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Now, just a little side note, for those of you who aren't as familiar, sometimes we can see in the Bible, in especially the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, there's actually 6 of those books, so 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We often see some doubling up of some stories across these books, and that's because they were written by different people in different times for different purposes. So sometimes we'll see the same story, but it might be worded a little bit different, there might be different emphasis placed on it, but that's because one was written by a court scribe for the purpose of making the king look good, and then another book was written with the purpose of instructing people in spiritual things, in the context of what's happened historically in the kingdom of Israel and Judah and stuff like that. So you can actually see sometimes some slight differences, but of the same story. So we're going to be looking more at 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and that's really just because that's where I looked at this story first, and then I found out a little while ago this afternoon that it's actually in 2 Samuel chapter 24 as well. But it's essentially the same deal. So we're going to just look over at 1 Chronicles chapter 21. Let's turn there. Okay, so we're just going to quickly read through at least part of it, if not the whole chapter. It's not a very long one. Stick with me. So it says, "Now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. So David said to Joab and to the leaders of the people, 'Go, number Israel from Beersheba to Dan,'" so from the south to the north, "'and bring the number of them to me that I may know it.' And Joab answered, 'May the Lord make his people 100 times more than they are. But my lord the king, are they not all my lord's servants? Why then does my lord require this thing? Why should he be a cause of guilt in Israel?' Clearly, Joab doesn't think that this is a good idea. Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed against Joab. And in 2 Samuel it says against Joab and the officers of the army as well. So it's not just Joab trying to convince David that this is not a great idea, but it's like Joab, who is the general of the army. So he's the guy in charge of the army, and also some of the other officers are like, King, like, this is not a great idea. Why are you doing this? And this has always confused me. Like, why was this such a big deal? And it was only when I read that passage in Exodus that it started kind of making a bit more sense. Why maybe it wasn't the greatest thing to do. And yet I still had some more questions. So let's keep reading through and we'll get back to those questions in a minute. "Nevertheless, the king's word prevailed, and Joab departed and went throughout all Israel and came to Jerusalem." So he goes all over the land and comes back, and it actually takes him about 9 months to do this. 9 months and 20 days we see in 2 Samuel. "Then Joab gave the sum of the number of the people to David. All Israel had 1,100,000 men who drew the sword, and Judah had 470,000 men who drew the sword. But he did not count Levi and Benjamin, which are 2 other tribes, among them, for the king's word was abominable to Joab." Joab was like, "I'm not going to do this job 100% because I don't like it. I think it's a terrible idea, so I'm just going to skip part of it and not count everyone there. And God was displeased with this thing, therefore he struck Israel." I don't think it's saying that God is displeased with what Joab did. I think he's displeased with what David commanded to do. Now, we don't see in this passage what it means that God struck Israel. Over in 2 Samuel, it does say that, let's have a quick look at it. What does it say? "And David's heart condemned him after he had numbered the people." So we actually see that after this is all said and done, 10 months later, David's starting to feel a bit of guilt and a bit of conviction of sin that, hey, what I actually just did was not a good thing. And so whether God did anything else to strike Israel, like in some kind of, big smitey kind of way, we do see that something has caused this conviction of sin on David's heart, and he's like, oh no, what have I done? Okay, so heading back to 1 Chronicles. So David said to God, "I have sinned greatly." See, we see that conviction of sin again. "Because I have done this thing, but now I pray, take away the iniquity of your servant," that's me, King David, "for I have done very foolishly." Then God spoke to Gad. The Lord spoke to Gad, David's seer, his prophet, saying, "Go and tell David, saying, 'Thus says the Lord, I offer you 3 options. Choose one of them for yourself, that I may do it to you.' So Gad came to David and said to him, 'Thus saith the Lord, choose for yourself.'" This is kind of like a parent telling their child, all right, it's time to get a bit of punishment, but I'm going to let you choose your punishment. So this is actually a pretty good parenting style that we see in God, saying, hey, look, I'm giving you the option to choose your own punishment, so you actually have a bit more of an awareness of your sin and just have a bit more awareness and a bit more options in the situation. I'm not going to just completely come on super hard. You get to choose how this is going to play out. So the options were either 3 years of famine or 3 months to be defeated by your foes, your enemies, with the swords, of your enemies overtaking you, or else for 3 days of the sword of the Lord, the plague in the land, with the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the territory of Israel. So those 3 options were famine for 3 years, or 3 months of enemies overtaking them, or 3 days of God just letting his angel of death kind of do what he will in the land of Israel. Now consider what answer I should take back to him who sent me, back to God. And David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Please let me fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are very great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. Which is a really good option to pick, because we know that God is very merciful. David knows that God is very merciful. He's got, about 70 years of walking with God, knowing the character of God. And so instead of picking, I can financially prepare for, 7 years or 3 years of famine, or I can kind of try and economically prepare for 3 months of war or something. He's like, I know that it's not about me and the way that I can prepare myself for this. This is about the punishment that needs to come on every person, the opportunity to come on every person individually, because if he had picked war, or if he had picked famine, he, as one of the elite in society, would have been able to avoid the majority of the fallout of the situation. And yet, by choosing the option where the angel of the Lord gets to kill people with the plague, then that puts himself at the same level of vulnerability, him and his family at the same level of vulnerability as the poorest in the nation, who would have otherwise, definitely died of the famine, or of being destroyed by the enemies. Like the elite in society in those situations, they would have been able to pay their way out of the worst of it. And yet with the plague, as we know in recent situations, disease doesn't pick people based on how wealthy or influential they are. It just picks whoever's closest, right? So with picking this option, there was actually 2 things that came out of it. He showed that he was humble enough as the shepherd of the people to put his life on the line as much as everyone else's life was going to be put on the line. And also, one thing that really stood out to me, that reminded me of this story in the first place when I was reading in Exodus, was the result of, so that's going back in Exodus chapter 30, the rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less. This is an atonement, and you shall make an atonement. Oh, hold on, where is it? Basically, it's saying that, where is it? Oh, right, in verse 12, when you take the census of the children of Israel for their number, then every man shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, that there be no plague among them when you number them, right? So the original thing that Moses heard from God about taking a census of the people is that if you do it, every person needs to feel the financial burden of the situation, and if they don't, then there will be a plague. If there is no financial atonement, in a sense, for the sin of taking census, it still doesn't quite make sense to me, but there is more to it, so we'll unpack it in a minute, why it would be considered a sin. But there needs to be this financial payment for having gone through the process of a census, that the whole country would be like, nah, let's not do that. We don't want to have to pay extra taxes to God just because you want to count us all. But anyway, because they're like, at least when David did it, he didn't do it in the right way. He didn't give the money that was required to the temple as an atonement for the people. Then the natural result of that was a plague. And so when he picked a plague, he picked, the full playing out of, what God had said originally in the law of Moses. He was like, I'm going to stick with God. I'm going to, place my life in his merciful hands and the lives of everyone else in this nation that I am supposed to be in charge of. I'm supposed to be the shepherd of. I'm supposed to be watching out for and caring for. And I haven't done that very well, but I'm going to still trust in God's mercy in this situation and let this whole thing play out the way that he's originally designed it to be. So he picks the plague. Then what happens? Let me not fall into the hand of man, he says. So the Lord sent a plague upon Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell. And God sent an angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. As he was destroying, the Lord looked and relented of the disaster and said to the angel who was destroying, "It is enough. Now restrain your hand." And the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan. Now this is where this story gets a bit more interesting. How much more is there? Yeah, so I'm going to read through it. It's a pretty good part of the story. You guys will want to hear it. Okay, so the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So Ornan the Jebusite, at this point in the way it's being told, it doesn't seem to be anybody special. However, if we look over at 2 Samuel chapter 24, they actually use the word Araunah. Now, Araunah is actually the word for king in the Jebusite sort of language. So Jerusalem, before King David came to live there and reign from there, it was actually called Jebus. And when David was there, he changed the name to Jerusalem. Okay? And so Jebus is the ancient name for the same place that is now Jerusalem. And before David took over as a king of Israel, they had a whole long line of people all the way back to Melchizedek and probably even further back of kings and priests who were reigning who were Canaanites. Okay, and so the Canaanite way of ruling, there was a guy in charge and the king was called the Araunah. Okay, so this guy Ornan, the Jebusite, was actually the old king of Jebus, and we see a few chapters earlier than this, at the very start of King David's reign, when he comes into power in Jerusalem. So this is 7 years after he started reigning as a king in Hebron down in the south. He's now moved to Jebus or Jerusalem. He gets his guys to sneak in through the well and take over the city, but it's actually not a violent takeover. Like, the king who's already there doesn't get his head chopped off or anything. We don't actually see what happens until much later. We see he's still hanging around. This guy called Araunah or Ornan, the Jebusite, is still there. So they have a pretty decent working relationship. There hasn't been any bloodshed, and the name Jerusalem and the name Jebus actually mean peace. And so it's great to see that there was this peaceful takeover. It wasn't a bloody takeover way back in the day. So now with that little bit of extra context here, let's have a look what happens. So the angel of the Lord stood by the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So it's the place where it's high up on a hill, and it's a place where when they sort out the wheat, there's plenty of breezes to come and take away all the dirt and the bits that don't belong, you know, in the actual granules of wheat that you're going to use to make flour. They want to have all the dust and all the chaff, you know, going away off in the breeze. So it's a high place, which in those times was also considered to be a holy place. Anywhere that was high, anywhere that was closest to heaven, closest up in the sky, was a good place for spiritual things to happen. So then David lifted his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven. And he was just kind of like hovering, levitating up there in the sky a bit, having in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. So there's still somewhat of a threat to the city. The city hasn't been struck by this plague yet, but the angel of the Lord, he's still there, and he's still in a pretty menacing stance. Like, the danger isn't over yet. There's still stuff that needs to be done. So he sees this angel with his hand drawn, with a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. So David and the elders, so all the counselors of the kingdom, clothed in sackcloth, coming very humbly, they fell on their faces. And David said to God, "Was it not I who commanded the people to be numbered? I am the one who has sinned and done evil indeed. But these sheep, what have they done? Let your hand, I pray, O Lord my God, be against me and my father's house, but not against your people, that they should be plagued." Now, this is a good thing that King David does. He knows that he is the shepherd of the kingdom. He, you know, as a teenager, he was a shepherd of sheep, and he knew that anything that happened to those sheep was on him. if he wasn't responsible enough, if he, had a good sleep that night and a wolf came and took some sheep away, it was on him. It was his responsibility as the shepherd, as the leader, to really take the fall. And because it was his doing to actually get everyone numbered in the first place, for his own personal reasons that we haven't quite touched on yet, he knew, hey, look, I am the shepherd here. It's my responsibility. All these people, they've done nothing wrong. This is all of my doing. Lord, I am very aware of that. Please don't let them be harmed because of me. I can't stand to bear it, right? And so he begs God and says, look, let this land on me. Therefore, the angel of the Lord commanded Gad to say to David that David should go and make an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So David went up at the word of the Lord, which he had spoken in the name of the Lord, at the word of Gad, which he had spoken in the name of the Lord. Now Ornan turned and saw the angel, and his 4 sons who were with him hid themselves. But Ornan, you know what? He continued threshing wheat. He was like, it's fine. I have no issue with this. There's a big scary looking angel just chilling over there with his sword out. That's fine. I'm cool with that. I just love it. He's so chill. He's just, the chillest guy. He's like, no issues here for me. So David came to Ornan, and Ornan looked and saw David, and he went out from the threshing floor and bowed before David with his face to the ground. He's showing proper respect to the guy who's now in charge, even though he used to be the guy in charge. Then David said to Ornan, grant me the place of this threshing floor that I may build an altar on it to the Lord. Now this is something that God did tell him to do. Right then, the angel told Gad to tell David, go and make this altar in this place. Whereas at the start of this whole chapter, we see that God was not telling David to go and number the people. We actually have to listen for what God is telling us to do versus the things that we just feel like doing, because we see in the very first line of this chapter, now Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. This was very likely from a place of pride, a place of David wanting to just know how many people were in his kingdom and how many he could rely on to go to war, so that he could actually maybe start planning to take over even more countries around him, instead of just waiting on God and seeing which way God led next for conquering the nations around him, or, if there was a threat from another nation coming against him in his country, then just relying on God to come through and provide the victories. No, this time he wanted to see how he could personally make things happen and how he could personally get the glory for himself. This is an issue for a lot of leaders. We see he's been a leader of this nation for a very long time. He started out really humble, but as life kept happening, he kept stumbling a bit more and a bit more over and over again. There was a lot of bad things that he did towards the end of his life, as he had a lot more victories under his belt that maybe he wasn't so inclined to attribute to God. And so we can see here, Satan is actually encouraging David to go out and number these people from a place of his own pride, a place of his own self-sufficiency, instead of relying on God. Okay? So that is like the major motive that we can draw out of what's going on here from the context. So back to David and Ornan. David asks, grant me the place of this threshing floor so I can build this altar to the Lord. You shall grant it to me for the full price, that the plague may be withdrawn from the people. That's a really important thing to take notice of. David, as we've just seen, has done this census, and he didn't actually do it in the way that God originally intended, where there was a price that needed to be paid for it to atone for the sin of taking census. So there is a financial element to this entire story that goes from the very beginning all the way to the end. And here we see a test for David. He says, grant it to me for the full price, that the plague may be withdrawn from the people. But Ornan said to David, take it to yourself and let my lord the king do what is good in his eyes. Look, I also give you the oxen for burnt offerings, the threshing implements for the wood, and the wheat for the grain offering. I give it all. He was very generous. He wanted to help. He was like, let me help you. Like, I like you. Like, here's all the stuff that you want and need. And he says, and then the king And then King David said to Ornan, "No, but I will surely buy it for the full price, for I will not take what is yours for the Lord, nor offer burnt offerings with that which costs me nothing." Okay, there's this element of there is personal sacrifice that needs to be involved in this situation. When we are in relationship with God, Jesus full on sacrificed his life for us so that we can be in right relationship with God. But that also requires sometimes for us to make sacrifices in our life and in our relationship with God. There are things that we do that we actually have to face the consequences of, and there is a cost, okay? So we can't just brush it off and not experience some of the consequences required just because somebody else is willing to give generously, okay? There are some things where we have to fully count the cost, as Jesus says. We have to count the cost, and we actually have to be willing to pay it ourselves and not just take what other people are willing to give because of the generosity of their own hearts, okay? So we're seeing this financial test on David right now, and he passes it, which is really great. He can see that, hey, there was a financial element to my sin, and I really need to make sure that it's covered in full so that so this plague is put away, right? So David gave Ornan a certain amount of money, and he bought the place. And David built there an altar to the Lord and burnt offerings and peace offerings, and called on the Lord, and he answered him from heaven by fire on the altar of burnt offering. So the Lord commanded the angel, and he returned his sword to its sheath. So this whole time, this entire transaction, there's the angel in the background with his arm drawn out, with his sword drawn out. There is still a stance of, you're not okay yet. You're not out of this yet. There is still danger if you do not make the right decision in this moment. So once the whole transaction is taken, the place is bought, the altar is erected, the offerings are made, and the sacrifices are made, the atonement is completed, then the angel's like, okay, it's fine now. I'll put my sword away. It's all good. I'm not going to go kill anyone at this point. Sweet. So at that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle of the Lord and the altar of the burnt offering which Moses had made in the wilderness were at that time at the high place in Gibeon, a whole other different city. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. Fair enough. It's pretty scary, I reckon, if it's going to be right up in your face. So we can see quite a few different things that have come through the story. It's honestly such a fascinating story to me when I was reading it earlier this week. One thing that really came out of this story for me was God cares about our motives. God really cares about the reason that we do things. We saw in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 to 16, that God actually made provision for a census being made. Today, governments take census of their people, but they are not governments that are actually governed by God, right? But this particular country, this particular nation was God's people, right? And when he actually made allowance for a king, he didn't say that the people belonged to the king. No, all the people, including the king, belong to God. And so for a king to take it upon himself to take census and to know how many people he had to work with, that was not really his place. And so if he really wanted to do that, there needed to be a financial obstacle for that to take place, where everyone's like, oh, I don't really want to do this, but okay, if you, the king, really want to do this, it's just going to cost everyone a whole bunch of money. And if it doesn't cost a whole bunch of money, it's going to cost our literal lives because of the plague. Okay, so God put a few obstacles in place to kind of deter this from ever happening in the first place, so that the kings would be not as inclined to rely on their own resources at hand, okay? That they were supposed to actually rely on God and to turn away from their personal pride, but turn in humility to God and rely on him, okay? So that's something that God put in place from the very beginning of this emerging nation during the Exodus in the wilderness. So he really cares about our motives. When the census was done in the way that it was done by David, it was done from this place of pride. It was done from this place of Satan actually getting him to do it. And because of the pride, there was this whole backlash. There was this whole fallout. There was 70,000 people who died because it was not done according to God's word, and it wasn't done according to his command, and it wasn't done according to the original provision for it being done. And so God really cares about our motives enough, and he really cares about our sanctification. There is a passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3, and it says this: "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification." Okay, and sanctification really just means making or declaring someone or something holy, or making someone freed from sin and to be purified. Okay, so this is something that God really cares about for each of us. He is such a good parent that he actually does discipline us. He doesn't let us get away with whatever we want to do from our own selfishness and pride. He actually makes there be results or consequences of our actions when they are not in accordance to his will. And so he takes us through this process of sanctification. Sanctification is not like you get saved and all of a sudden you're perfect and you always will be from forever onwards. No, there are people who have been Christians their whole lives, like me, people who have been saved from a very early age. I got baptized literally half my life ago, and I'm still very much going through this process of sanctification and learning that I am not great, and there's a lot more purification process to go. Okay, so this is this is just something I really wanted to share with you, that there is a process that we all need to go on, that if there is sin in our lives, God will show us and he will give us an opportunity to be corrected. I need to make it very clear though, salvationally, we are saved by our faith in Jesus' death for us. However, there is an ongoing process beyond that for us to become more like Jesus, to reflect his character even more. We do not get saved by our works or this action of atonement by paying for our census or whatever it is. No, that is something completely different. But we need to understand there is this separation between our salvation comes from Jesus and all that he did, and our just accepting of that and being in this relationship with him. But that relationship with Jesus does require daily commitment, daily sacrifice to self, daily growth, daily sanctification, becoming more like him. And we'll just be able to see the fruits of our relationship with him by the way that we love the people around us more and more, by the way that we have the fruit of the Holy Spirit in our lives. So that's all I really had to share with you guys today. Sorry, it's a little bit longer than usual, but I really hope that's helped you. I found this story really fascinating. I hope you did too. Let me know in the comments below what was something that you found really fascinating, and I will see you guys again next Friday. Bye!